Have you wondered what financial advisors actually think about finances? This is your sneak peek at the conversations within Financial Design Studio. Michelle Smallenberger, the CEO here, will be your host as you go behind the designs.
All right, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Smallenberger, a financial advisor and the CEO here at Financial Design Studio. And back in episode 35, we updated you on what's new with the FAFSA. But since that episode, a friend has reached out after hearing it and said, wait, let's do a college planning 2.0 because there's so much more that we could talk about. So that is what we're going to talk about today as we are digging deeper. And I know this is going to be so helpful for so many people, as you're going to get to hear from a professional's perspective on how to prepare your kids for college. I'm welcoming Nate Bargar, who is a post-secondary counselor. So welcome, Nate. Thank you for being here.
Good afternoon, Michelle. Happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me and enjoyed the first session. I thought, wow, that stuff's kind of what I do all day, every day. So I'd love to talk more about it.
Exactly. And this is going to be so great. I know just even as we've been talking, preparing for this and what are the additional things, there's so many questions that parents have and students have. So I know this is going to be really valuable as they're preparing for college. Why don't you just share so everybody knows why you know all of this? Why don't you just share kind of what you do? So I know I said you're a post-secondary counselor. What does that mean? Just kind of start there.
So yeah, the title, like I said, is post-secondary counselor. My credential, my master's degree is actually in school counseling, and my interest in doing this. So I work in the high school setting, in the Chicagoland suburbs, and my interest for this first really came probably at least 10 years before I actually got my master's degree. I was working in college admissions. I worked in college admissions for about 10 and a half years at my alma mater, which is Illinois State University. I was on campus for 4.5 years, and then moved up to Chicagoland and was living in Chicagoland so I could, more easily be in the places where most of Illinois State student population comes from. Then I got a job doing same thing, Chicagoland based for University of Cincinnati, which is a very large urban public university in Cincinnati, Ohio. Did that for 2.5 years, and then got the opportunity to move into the high school side at a private high school. And as part of that, they also paid for my master's in school counseling, which was huge. Mm-hmm. But it was pretty interesting that we were having our second child. I was starting a new job, and I was starting my master's all within about 3 months of each other. So there was a lot going on there, but it was something that I always, that was part of the reason that I came to Chicagoland, was to try and get that master's, and just, I never got started, and then got the opportunity. And then after 5 years there, I'm now in my second year at a public high school. So
just hearing like your experience from kind of college into just kind of the working world and where you've been, it just highlights how valuable this is going to be for people, because you've seen different types of schools where students are coming from and going to college. You've been in that college admissions environment. So you've really gotten experience from so many different sides of this piece. Mm-hmm. And so I know that you have a lot to share. What inspired you to want to do this? Kind of share a little bit too about like maybe your own specific college journey. Like, how did you leave high school to go to college?
For sure. So, and kind of going back on something you just talked about, what's interesting too about the world of college admissions is that while, you're competing for students, it's amazing how collaborative college admissions professionals are, no matter who you work for. So you get to learn a little bit about small private liberal arts institutions, highly selective, Catholic institutions, religious-based institutions. So a lot of great opportunities. But my story, I'm actually from a very rural Western Illinois high school. I had 97 people in my graduating class, and I didn't, like a lot of others, I didn't really know what I want to do. I had an older brother who had spent some time at a community college, spent some time at a 4-year institution, and unfortunately, never got the opportunity to get either an associate's or a bachelor's degree. So the big thing was like, hey, we want you to go, but we want you to do what you need to do when you get there as well. I come from a very blue collar family. Both parents, dad was a longtime union laborer. Mom worked at a coal burning power plant. They both started their careers with the companies they retired from as custodians, so they that got their foot in the door. So the big thing was, hey, we want you to go. We want you to be successful. We don't have any thought one way or the other what you do, but I basically grabbed 3 applications. And at that time, so I grabbed applications for University of Illinois, Illinois State, Western Illinois University, all paper applications at the time, which we know is unheard of, right? At that time, University of Illinois was one of the only ones charging an application fee of $40, which now is a bargain. Western Illinois was too close to home. Filled out the Illinois State application, did the essay on a word processor, so somewhere between a computer and a typewriter, and got in there and really enjoyed my time there. I got a degree in communication. And in terms of like how I knew that, I just knew I didn't want to study world language, math, or science. So it's like, okay, what else do you do? Also, definitely a first generation student. So, what that meant for us back then is similar but different to what that means for students now. And for folks that don't know what a first generation student is, I think the U.S. Department of Ed definition is a student whose parents did not receive a bachelor's degree or any sort of degree in the United States. So, a family, a parent could have gone to community college or not graduated from college. They're still technically first generation. Like I mentioned, I had an older brother, but because he's 4 years older, they're three years and change older than me. We're obviously of the same generation. So that's where the first generation piece comes from. And that's a big thing now as well when it comes to access and information, is the idea of first generation. And that was me. So when I graduated from college, didn't know what I was going to do then either. Took a job in the subprime lending market, which I'm sure, Michelle, you could do a podcast just on that and the repercussions of what that was.
Yeah.
I needed a paycheck and, don't want to know what happened to that paper that I wrote back then. But again, a conversation for another day. And got very lucky when I was kind of transitioning between jobs to get into college admissions. And it's kind of dictated where I am, and it's amazing. So.
Yeah. I think it's just really helpful to just kind of hear like different people's stories that, as they went through college. So you left high school. So it's kind of a smaller high school, then to a 4-year public university, and then graduated from there to then the working world. It's helpful because we're going to talk about different options that people have. That was my story too. So very similar. I think we had like 100 in our graduating class. So very similar in rural Kansas, and then went to Kansas State, a 4-year public university. So very common. So I think that's going to be helpful. All just kind of helps to paint the picture of the experience you've had as you're speaking into these questions. I guess the first thing that we think of when students are like, when they come to you, probably the first thing they need to think of is not necessarily where I'm going to college first, but what am I going to major in? What is it I even want to do? What are my interests, or where do they even start? So I guess if a student comes to you, where do you start really kind of in that conversation of what should I do and what should I major in?
Yeah. And I think that's one of the hardest things for students and families, especially, Michelle, you and I talking about our paths. That's the other thing that we have to make sure that we recognize as well, as what college costs now and what it costs when we went are two very, very different things, right?
Yeah.
The other thing that I think I had student loans as well. We use student loans to help pay for that. But I think we as adults do our students a disservice in a lot of ways by putting a lot of pressure on them sometimes to know what they want to do with the rest of their lives, right? They're 14 to 18, that if we look back at our own journeys, how many of us knew exactly what we wanted to do at 14 to 18? And I think a few years ago, there was some sort of statistic thrown out there that of those that have college degrees, only about 1/3 work in the actual industry that their college degree was in, right? So, and I always tell students, hey, ask the adults in your world if they went to college, if they went, where did they go and what their degree is in. And the answer that you're going to get a lot of times is, well, my degree is in this, but this is what I do now, or I've never worked in that, or whatever it might be, right? But when it comes to the idea of the actual major, It's what are students interested in, but I think at the same time, what aren't they interested in? And that's obviously a good conversation to have with juniors and seniors. When you have it as a freshman and sophomore, you have to be very careful because it's like, okay, hey, you don't like math, you don't like science. There's plenty of things that you can do with that. But then they think that that's kind of their hall pass to, blow off math and science for the next 2 or 3 years. And unfortunately, that's not the case. I think it's okay. And I think we need to give our young people space to not like things. That doesn't mean you have to do it, right? But if you don't like math and physics, then engineering isn't probably for you, but
Yes.
There's all sorts of other things that we can do, right?
Yes.
You hear a lot of times, you got get a degree in business or there's no jobs out there for you. You get a degree in public relations and do many of the same things and never have to take business calculus, right? You may not like public speaking. I have an actuary degree for you and the amount of money you make doing things like that, right? So it's just the idea of kind of sorting through them or sorting through where they're at, getting an idea, when I go at this idea of what don't you like, we all have things that we want to avoid and that's okay. But it's a matter of how do we pivot to those things and recognize those things that we are good at and still do some of the similar things. And I guess just the last piece of it would be is then, and that's just my time in the industry. Okay, you're telling me you don't like these things. Here's probably 5 majors that you've never heard of that have all sorts of amazing opportunities that, could get you all sorts of jobs and we go from there.
I think that's such a great other half of the question. What should I major in? What am I good at? What do I like? But what don't I like? Because if you could wipe out half of the options by saying these are not for me, that really, really helps to, then focus your time on what is left and what do I maybe enjoy. Okay. Yeah, I think that's so helpful though, because we do think, okay, if my strengths are in business, so maybe some type of numbers or applying those and analyzing them, we do just think, well, because then it's kind of, well, what industry do I want to work in? And so what you're really helping them to do is kind of pair that with, there is just general business, but there's business. And if you like agriculture or other forms of that, or, business and numbers, there's financial planning, those are great examples of how, just to help kids think differently about it. So those are really good examples. Thanks for sharing that. Okay. And I think something you shared, a book that is kind of parents have the best of intentions.
So it's an article that I shared a lot of the evening programs at my school. It's an article from the director of admissions at Georgia Technological Institute, I think is the exact name, but we all know it as Georgia Tech. A guy by the name of Rick Clark. He wrote an article and he's actually written some books about this whole process. But the article was called Best of Intentions. And basically what it was about is the role that we as adults play in this process, that when our students or our young people come to us, they're coming to us confiding in us on a lot of things, right? And then this is where my school counseling comes in. This is where we get all social, emotional, and that sort of stuff that we like it, we get excited, but also being very careful sometimes of what we share with our young people. And part of it is just adults, especially adults that aren't in education, that aren't necessarily used to having awkward conversations with 14 to 18-year-olds and being able to kind of live in that awkwardness.
Yeah.
And a lot of what we're doing as adults is just trying to help, but understanding that in some cases we may be adding to their angst and anxiety, give them that safe listening space. The other thing we talk to families about all the time, because parents get very excited about this, especially for those that are involved in any variety of things and want to talk to their students about this all the time. We talk a lot about the idea of making designated time for this, probably starting somewhere in the junior year, and say, okay, Sunday after, 5:00 or whatever it is, we're going to spend 1 hour talking about college stuff. During that time, I will ask you all the questions that I have. And then for the rest of the week, no questions, right? Yeah. You are free to ask me any and all questions that you have at any time, but I'm not going to ask you. But please understand that during that hour, I need you to come with answers. And it's also an amazing opportunity for students or for parents and caregivers to kind of let out the rope a little bit, right? Start to give their students that autonomy, the power of self-advocacy and young people. That's the other thing that I think comes from the cost of college, is that we're now afraid as adults to give our students the power of self-advocacy, where we all know whatever post-secondary path they choose, as soon as they leave our houses, there is no more, you can't email your child's biology professor and ask why they didn't do well on this test. I mean, you can try, but it's going to get a giggle and a delete, right?
Yeah.
Or if that student is entering the workforce, go ahead and try to call in sick for your student and see how much longer they're employed at that entity as well. So that's really a main thing, is that if you provide that safe space, that way you are still heard, but then they feel empowered and don't feel like they're facing a constant week-long interrogation all the time of, things that they don't know about yet.
Yeah, that's helpful. So I guess at those like holiday gatherings, like a well-meaning relative would you just suggest like don't say anything, or are there questions, like ways you can ask about it?
Yep. I would say just ask how they're doing. Hey, how's high school? What's going on? Maybe just say, have you looked at any schools, right? What I tell students to do is they know at the holiday gatherings who's going to start asking questions, right? Yeah, everybody has that relative. For me, it's, my Aunt Shirley that always has questions. Why don't you ask them questions first? Hey, that's a good question. Thanks for asking. Where did you go to school? What did you major in? What's your degree in? Did you have student loans? Those sorts of things that if you turn it around on them, you're in control of the conversation now, which what a great skill for a 17 or 18-year-old or 16-year-old is, to be in control of a conversation, because they're used to adults controlling all those. And so that, we kind of, what I always say is I give you permission to control that conversation with them, because we don't know what they're going through. And it's for the same reason with seniors right now. I never ask them, hey, where are you going to college? Because they don't know yet. They still have some time to decide. But how do I know that last night wasn't the first time they've had the conversation at home about what family can afford? And it's very, very different than what their dream school is. And they may not be in a very good social, emotional place with that right now. Yeah. To be able to talk about it. So again, it's just this idea of, again, adults have the best of intentions, and what we think are throwaway questions to young folks may mean a ton to them based on what's going on in their life. Yeah. Yeah. So actually, if I could back up a little bit too, and the idea of like what they want to do after high school, that's why my title is post-secondary counselor, because there are a lot of other options besides either a 2 or a 4-year college, right? There are huge needs in the trades right now. A friend told me that is a union carpenter, and I've never been able to, confirm this by way of any research, but it makes sense. The average age of a union carpenter right now is like 56 years old. Wow. Right. So many of our tradespeople are the oldest of Gen X, the baby boomers that are upon retirement, that the electricians union, as there's so many, so much what as it relates to energy and conservation of energy and renewable energy. I think I mentioned my mom worked a long time at a coal burning power plant. There are huge needs for heavy equipment operators, things like that. Of course, there's always the military option, going straight to the workforce. So there are so many options out there, but there's just so much. And a lot of it is based on social media, the media itself that talks about it. And it seems like there's only one path after high school graduation. And actually, there's a little bit of an argument that some of the college pipelines are, I don't know that oversaturated is the right way to put it, because there's still plenty of places that can use plenty of students, but there is an overemphasis and I don't know that we've forgotten, but maybe we've overlooked, and I don't know that discredited is the right word, but I think my point in this is that we have to get back to the idea that options that aren't just college are options, right? And I think the other thing that happens in the school setting is that you are one of two things. You're an AP student or you're a trades workforce military student. AP students can be electricians as well, and those that are electricians can sure as they can go to any variety of colleges and study a variety of things. So and I think that if anybody's tried to hire somebody to fix a light switch in their house lately or anything like that, there's a huge need for folks to do those things, and I think it's very important that we leave those doors open and reinforce that whatever you see your path is as a young person, it is valid, right? Because if we, talk about the idea of college debt and things like that, that's the other thing is, it's not free. If you think about a 4 or 5 year apprenticeship in the electricians union, how, your ability to work full time and that sort of thing. So there's definitely some give and take with that. But at the same time, the debt that you're going to incur is significantly different. And I think it's very, very important that we create that space and in some ways retake that space and encourage our students to do that. Because I think that, Michelle, you and I being from rural communities, we probably know all sorts of people that probably shouldn't have gone to college and they did for whatever reason, and that time seemed right. But I think that many of us as adults know people in our lives that had they just gone to the military or had they just gone to whatever, that things would have worked out for them in a different way. So I just want to make sure that I make that piece important as well. Right.
Yeah, no, that's great. Cause that was actually the second part to that question of like, what do you think about all these other options? So I think that's so helpful because community college and trade schools and all of these, like even steps along the way, potentially to a larger or what's considered a 4 or 5 year public school can still be paths to actually get you where you're trying to go. So that's really helpful.
Yeah. And then you mentioned community college and I think those are great options. I do think that sometimes the community college, though, is portrayed as entirely too simplistic. Oh, hey, it's more affordable, so why wouldn't everybody just go do that and then go on from there? Which I get the sentiment, but as we were discussing before, we went on air today, that if I look at my community college was 35 minutes away, and I wasn't the most motivated of students. It's not that I wasn't completely unmotivated, but at the same time, if I knew it was 35 minutes away, bad weather, I got up late, so now I'm going to be late for class, park in the back of the parking lot, walk through the snow, walk through the rain, it would have been very easy to just stay home and not do anything today. And then, report to my food service or retail job or whatever it was, that afternoon. Where going to a 4-year institution where I was far from a Rhodes Scholar, but I still, the idea that it was at most a 10-minute walk from where I woke up that morning to class, I was still there, right? I wasn't always retaining everything that I needed, and I wasn't always getting all A's. But the fact that, like, for me personally, I have a college degree because I was there, right? Where there's a lot of other folks they learn a lot by that idea of staying home and learning about themselves. So that's, with the community college piece. And again, that's not to say that it's absolutely an amazing option. But I think it's important to not oversimplify it as well. So,
yeah. I think that's so helpful. We're going to kind of like here in a minute, we're going to shift into talking about that, like really more in depth is kind of this return on your investment. So like you're saying, these are big investments that you're making. If you're having to pay for something, if it's 4 years, if it's 2 years, if it's some version of that, you pay a lot of money. Am I really going to get back, what I've put into it? So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I guess when we talk, let's kind of shift just like college. We're going to talk about that one specifically. really quick or for now, but let's talk about like some of these, like if I go onto a website and I'm looking up a university, typically you will see this is the tuition and books and housing. Those are the typical costs that they list. Is that pretty much what, I mean, when we're looking at like the real costs that we're going to pay, is that it? Or are there others that aren't included, or is it not that high?
For sure. It's what the colleges call direct versus indirect costs, and direct costs are the tuition and fees and room and board. And even books aren't necessarily part of that anymore. They're part of the indirect because, again, different than when we went to school and you go to the campus bookstore and they share, they're online. There are so many different options out there. But when a family comes to me and says, hey, let's compare the cost of school A versus school B, I'm only looking at the tuition and fees and room and board as it directly relates to others. Now, obviously, there are some other indirect costs, right? If you go to Kansas State and you have to get to Manhattan, Kansas from suburban Chicago, it's either a 10-hour drive or, a lot of people don't realize there's a direct flight out of O'Hare right into the amazing Manhattan Airport, which is like 2 or 4 gates. It's amazing, right? Yeah. But because that's not a major hub, what it costs for that flight as opposed to flying into Topeka or Kansas City and then taking a bus or get a ride from a friend or whatever it might be. The way that I always explain it to students too, when it comes to this idea of distance and getting back and forth, what does that distance look like when you get out of your 1 o'clock class on a Friday at 2 o'clock and you have to get in the car for an 8-hour drive? You're going to get home at 10 or 11 o'clock. What does that look like on, Sunday evening, Sunday afternoon after you've had, a late lunch, early dinner with the family and leave at 4 and get in the car and then have to be back at a 10 a.m. or 9 a.m. class the next day. So there's obviously the idea of if you're driving, having a car on campus, where you park the car, maintenance of a car, when you get there, you don't want to eat in the dining center all the time. How much does it cost? For food, if you go to a more urban school, right? If you go to a school in Chicago, you'll use DePaul as an example, that if you live in Lincoln Park, getting an apartment, even student housing in Lincoln Park looks very, very different than it does to, live in a residence hall or even live in an apartment in Champaign-Urbana. And so I will say as a whole, I leave those conversations up to the family. And in most of my experiences, there's kind of an understanding that families have that like, hey, we'll kind of figure that out. We're more worried about the direct costs. How do I pay my actual tuition and fees and room and board? Yeah. That's, and then, some schools only require 1 year on campus, some schools 2 years. So what does it look like to move off campus? And in that you'll find it's pretty similar unless, the other thing that's changed significantly is you go look at student housing and there are pools, there are 4-bedroom, 4-bathroom. It's things have changed. So yeah,
I did not.
No, not at all. No. I'm still shocked that the apartments that I lived in when I did go to school are still standing and being rented. So, so again, a family understands whether they have the resources and the opportunities to have the bells, whistles, amenities, that sort of thing.
Well, and I think too, as we kind of start to talk about like a return on investment, if we just kind of talk about housing, I think once you kind of decide where you're going to go, or as you're deciding between maybe a few different options, it's looking at what are the opportunities. So you have your, where you're going to live in the residence hall, or are there scholarship houses? I know I was in a 4-H scholarship house, but some of those, it was even just depending. So it's really looking and seeing what's available, not just assuming, I think that, I have to live in the dorm for my first or second year. There might be other housing options that are cheaper. But I think to give you the experience when I just think, okay, so I paid less when I was in the scholarship house. And now after you've been in school, even the first year, if you live in the dorms, you're kind of like, okay, the first, second year, you kind of see how things go. Now your third and fourth year, you've met people, you know what, around campus is like, you know what housing costs. And so you're starting to learn and see, oh, I could share a house with 4 people and that's going to be similar cost. And then, you're starting to learn about life and, okay, I need to have utilities and things like this and how to pay those bills on time. And then when you leave college, it's okay, now I'm either on my own or again, I'm living somewhere, but all of those experiences, even just in the housing situation, I was learning so that when I left, it was much easier to evaluate, okay, if I get an apartment or if is it a house I'm renting, what is that? What are the costs? And knowing, just like you're describing with college, those additional costs too. Yeah. It's all of these like life experiences, I think, that kind of factor into this return on what I'm getting and what I'm paying. And so I think there's so much that kids can learn too. Staying on this theme of return on investment. So let's say I know that I want to be in engineering, or I know I want to go to a certain school because of the program. Like, is that really expensive school worth it? Or should I be going to a cheaper school where I'm going to get the same thing?
Yeah, I think that's the major marketing piece of the institution, right? Is they are doing everything that they can to convince you that the name of their institution and the name on their diploma is worth what they're charging, right? And I get that. And there is a certain amount of that yes, there, if you go to Harvard, the Harvard degree, it means something, right? But at the same time, you have to have the money to pay for that. And that's one of the things that families have to start having the conversation, and actually is already happening at my house with a 10 and a 6-year-old, especially when there's 2 siblings and one will go to college and one will enter high school, that look, when you go to college, your brother still has to eat and have clothes to wear and a place to live and that sort of thing. Yeah. So, yes, there's the return on the investment, but there are also certain price points that how do you ever get that back if you have to borrow money, right? There are more colleges than any of us will like to admit that direct cost that we talked about earlier is now in the high 8s or low 9s. And I mean high 80s, low 90s. That's per year for 4 years. Right. Yeah. And so if you look at the idea and if you plan well, and part of filling out the FAFSA is the idea of qualifying for the student loans, $5,500 as a freshman, $6,500 as a sophomore, $7,500 after that, up to 6 years. So a 4 year is $27,000. That's in the student's name. There are loans that the parents can take out, but at what point it's too much, right? Yeah. And so, where there's schools, you hear a lot about Big Ten schools, out of state publics recruiting suburban Chicagoland very hard. There are some that do that very purposely because they know that there are people that have the means and will pay what they're asking, right? Yeah. And so, I looked at a large flagship university in the Midwest with a student the other day. Tuition and fees, room and board, $76,000 per year. Wow. At a public institution, right? Yeah. And they would argue that their name on their diploma is worth that return on their investment. In some cases, it might be, right? But like the return on any investment, you got to have the money to put in the investment to get the return, right? Yes. And if you don't have the money to put in on the front end, what is it worth a second mortgage on your house? Is it worth, the other thing that I never talk about because I don't know enough about them and I don't want to because it changes is private student, right? Yeah. We know what the banking industry is, the banking industry and how does that stuff go? That's not to say that the government loans are perfect either, but at the same time, there's a certain sense of it's much more not necessarily lenient, but kind of. I mean, a private student loan is just a loan you get from the bank, and so if you have circumstances where you can't pay that back, a bank is not going to be as forgiving as student loans where they have things built in where if you're not working or things like that, depending on your income, things like that, if you're still in school, like there's just different factors. So you're exactly right where once you set yourself, depending on what you set yourself up with,
if you can't pay that back, the repercussions are going to be much more damaging and much more hard.
The other argument that I make to people all the time is, hey, it's a couple of things. It's name recognition, right? What you think is a name brand and what somebody in Wyoming thinks is a name brand might be different things, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I don't talk about name brands. I talk about name recognition. Just because you don't recognize that name doesn't mean that it's not high quality as well. But also the idea of if you get a degree and go apply for a job in Denver, does that employer in Denver know the difference between a degree from Oklahoma State and a degree from Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee? Probably not, right? Unless they're an alum of either, and then in that case, that's probably how you got there anyway.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's helpful though, because it's just putting it into perspective of I'm going to college for what? What is it I'm hoping to come out with? What is it like? Where is it I hope to be? And okay, so now if I'm going to come out with, if I'm getting 30,000 in debt a year in the process, if I'm coming out with 12,000 in debt or 120,000 in debt, is it worth it now? Because I'm going to be paying that back for a long time. And so it's, what is it worth? Like, how are you really setting your future self up with what you're going to come out with? What is that possible income and how quickly could I pay that back based on that salary? Those are the kind of things where it's like, it's got to be reasonable, because otherwise, like, there's just so many people now still with student loans that they're paying off for years and years. And so it just doesn't have to be that way, depending on the school programs that you choose. So,
and I think that's helpful. Part of it is our job as parents, right? To have those conversations, and I know we're going to talk about this later, but if I were having this conversation with if they were of college exploring age, they already know kind of where we're at with that. And I think it's very easy to get caught up in that race of, there's I don't know that vanity is the right word, but maybe it is. It's like, look how cool this shoe company sweatshirt looks on me. And when you pull up behind me at the corner of Quentin and 12, and you see these 4 stickers on the back of my, car, now you think things about me as a parent and an adult where it's like, well, no, it sounds like your kids had very good grades and did things as well. And that doesn't mean that you're not paying for it, right? But it's the idea of sometimes the name of the institution is also seen as a protection of certain social status or social class sort of thing, which, it's let's make it about the students and having those conversations earlier as parents to set that expectation. I kind of talked earlier about the idea of the senior who just had the money conversation with their parents the night before. What I would ask of your listeners is, or people that are watching is, you don't have to tell your student right off the bat, hey, we have $40,000 per year to send you to college.
Yes.
But create an understanding freshman, sophomore year of, hey, this is just kind of what to know. And that if you go over this, the rest is on you, sort of thing. That's the other thing that I always find fascinating is that, parents have already worked hard, saved a ton, but then when there's still not enough for that student's dream school, they're the ones filling out all of the private, the non-institutional scholarships and essentially writing the 500-word essay. It's my thought is, look, you've already done your hard work. If that institution that you can afford or go to with no debt isn't good enough, then it's up to them to figure that part out.
Yes.
The other thing is what you major in. You don't want to make it all about that, but if you're going to be, I'm also a proponent of not, when your student says, I want to major in piano performance, saying to them, great, how are you gonna pay the bills with that? Right. I get it. I get the sentiment. But there's a lot of other things that can be learned that are applicable soft skills, but at the same time, maybe piano performance without really good scholarships or talent-based scholarships, maybe that's one that you don't go pay $75,000 a year for, right? Education. There's a huge need for teachers right now. And again, we all know as teachers that we're never going to be millionaires, but at the same time, we make a comfortable living, and there's a ton of job opportunities available. But in doing so, you don't want to take on a bunch of debt, again, because you fall in love with the name. But believe me that a junior or a senior right now in 5 or 6 years, when they graduate from high school from college and go to get a teaching job, there's going to be jobs all over. Now, it may not be in the district that you went to or in your ideal place, but there's going to be spots for you to get your foot in the door. And then go on from there and find all sorts of opportunities.
It's so funny because you're talking about, how parents, they have a part to play, students have a part to play. And we're going to talk about that, especially as we kind of jump here in a second to talk about scholarship opportunities and where is this money at and how can we get it really quick. So I just think some of this too is you can choose a college that costs less, but you can still get great experience. You can still get the knowledge you need, the experience from working while you're at school from a college that costs half of what another one does. So I just think that's so critical, which is something we talked about in one of our episodes we just had, was kind of how to set your kids up for success. So that is something that becomes part of these conversations. Another episode that we just had, which is what you had responded to, was kind of what's going on with the FAFSA. So kind of just give us like a brief update of what you're seeing with the FAFSA since then.
Yeah, I mean, so the FAFSA a few years ago went back to this idea of what they call prior, right? So if you're filling out a FAFSA this year, you're using 2022 tax information. So that was a change. I think that might have changed for the 2019 or 2020 graduates. And then there was and so the other thing that changed is the idea that you can you can start completing the FAFSA in October. So then this time of year wasn't so crazy, right?
Yeah.
And so the Department of Education said, hey, we're going to redo the FAFSA. Great idea. Again, going back to what we talked about earlier, they did this with the best of intentions. But the rollout has been just, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, an absolute disaster. And so that's something that you guys talked about on the I think you said episode 35 is, hey, FAFSA's out. This is late December. They said it would be out by the end of the year. And I think that what happened is the Department of Education released the FAFSA and then the ball dropped in New York City, for the new year. So technically, yes, it was out before the end of the year sort of scenario. But in doing so, then everything was a soft launch and it was all glitchy. And so it was up, it was down, people would go on, issues there. Then the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, that's the other thing that I will tell you all is if anybody ever says, hey, pay money to fill out the FAFSA, say, no, thank you, I'll go work with my school counselor, the Illinois Student Assistance Commission, whatever it might be, all of these free entities to fill it out. But like a lot of other things, people think that there's got to be a catch in there somewhere, right? And I guess there might be, but is it worth that investment? But the FAFSA used to kick out something called the expected family contribution, or EFC. That's now changed to something called the SAI, or Student Aid Index. The difference is the lowest in EFC could be was 0. SAI can actually be negative now. It can go as low as negative 1,500. And basically what that's there to show is like, look, there's need and then there's significant need. And, a negative SAI would obviously indicate significant need, right? So that's supposed to be produced. The other thing is the FAFSA, when you complete it, you got a student aid report, or SAR. That is now called the FAFSA submission report. To kind of bring this all in, when people completed the FAFSAs, it was producing neither a FAFSA submission report or an SAI because of whatever is going on with this platform. So if anybody has any corrections, wants to add schools, to make a long story short, for a family that has not yet submitted FAFSA, they can't get back into their FAFSA right now. Now, to make this really fun, the colleges found out, or whatever, however it was decided, they can't upload that information. So in most cases, that's what colleges are doing right now is they're going through the FAFSAs of admitted students and putting, financial aid packages together. Well, now we found out that the colleges upload something called an ICER, which is institutional something something report, right? It's basically the information that they use. Colleges aren't even going to have access to these ICERs until mid-March. So again, another, celebrate St. Patty's Day and, the school getting your ICER to get your financial aid package. Well, then once they have that, they probably need a solid month to produce financial aid packages. And so traditionally, May 1st has been what's called the National Candidate Reply Date, that essentially, if you've been admitted, you need to tell a school by May 1st, many times with an enrollment deposit, that you are committing to that institution. That if you did not submit an enrollment deposit, in some cases, you have now, forfeited your spot at that institution, probably because you chose another institution. But if not, you're just going to have to possibly go to one of the others. But colleges and universities want to make sure that families have at the very least a month. So even those schools who, with a regular decision, would release an admission decision and a financial aid package mid-March to late March, and then have all of April to make a final visit and decide. Now that stuff may not even be out until mid-April, which has then prompted some institutions to go with either a May 15th National Candidate Reply Date or a June 1st National Candidate Reply Date.
Yeah.
Now, to make things really fun, guess what starts on college campuses as students graduate in the second or third week of May? Now you're invited to come to campus and register the first or second week of June. Now we're planning traveling, family vacations, younger sibling baseball and volleyball trips wherever they're going. So it's just this, it's a chain reaction of all this stuff. So
yeah, it's kind of this big spiraling effect of, and like you said, it was with the best of intentions. We're going to make this a simpler process and it's going to be available. And then it wasn't, and it wasn't, and it wasn't. And so it does push everything back. But I think that helps people too, because it's one of those having the choices that you want to go to and just knowing, okay, once I get this back, I can decide. So maybe that will help people to be able to decide. By the time they get it. But that's very helpful to know if they're even not getting those packages yet, there's reasons why. Right. So,
and if I could add one thing to that too, Michelle, when we're kind of talking about what you kind of started to talk about this in your last point of when you're looking at schools for scholarships and that sort of thing. One thing that we talked about in the pre-production meeting or the pre-show meeting, we'll call it, is the idea of some institutions offering automatic scholarships based on test score and GPA, which is great. But to kind of relate that to the FAFSA piece is, in some cases, there is an expectation that institutions are going to meet a family's need, what they think is their need, right? The only need that's being met is whatever the student aid index produces. Where if and again, and I say this because of, many people listening to this will be in suburban Chicagoland, out of state public institutions don't heavily recruit suburban Chicagoland to meet need. Right. So what I mean by that is a Pell Grant, for that sort of thing, FSEOG, something educational grant that I can't remember the acronym. But to make a long story short, if you're applying at an out-of-state institution and waiting for some sort of need, that's not really what they're there for, right? Now, that doesn't mean that they won't offer you a very nice merit-based scholarship. And in many cases, what they're trying to do is offer a scholarship that gets you within what I like to call sniffing distance of whatever the top price point is at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. If we can get within 5,000 to 7,000 of that, we might get somebody to jump that regularly gone to, the state flagship. But that's how they get the nice dorms and the climbing walls and the pools, because when you have enough people coming in from out of state and paying 10, 15, $20,000 more what an in-state student pays. That's why they're here. That's why if you go to the, college fair that Barrington has in April, you will see a ton of out-of-state institutions because they know that families from suburban Chicagoland will pay that money to leave the state. But like I said, with that, if you've received a merit-based scholarship from your institution, that's what you're going to pay. Don't be waiting for some sort of savior from the FAFSA, because that's not what it's there for.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think that's really helpful too, just clarifying people's expectations.
Yep.
So no, that's very useful. So now we're just going to shift to, because a lot of people's questions are, okay, so where are these scholarship opportunities? Okay, I know it costs a lot. I know I'm only, going to get a certain amount from the FAFSA or maybe from the school and what they're offering. So one just big general question is, where do people find scholarships? Do they actually even exist? Do people actually even get these? Just kind of touch on that a little bit, and then we'll dig into some more of the specifics.
For sure. The answer is yes, they do actually get them. One website that I think is great is a website called Going Merry. It's GOINGMERRY.com. And it's a scholarship matching site. So it's basically, it's going to go in and ask you a bunch of questions and then try to match you with scholarships. Are you left-handed? Do you have red hair? There's a scholarship out there for tall people that I think actually that deadline is passed, but they are random, and these aren't full rides. They're $500 to maybe $3,000. And what happens many times is people are, $500, I'm not doing that. Well, think about it this way. If you're a high school senior, you should be able to write a 500-word essay in less than an hour, right? That if you can use that one essay to be applied to 10 different scholarships, even if it's just one, and you get $500, guess what? You just got $500 for an hour's work.
Yeah.
That's work that I'm willing to do. That if when I get into the real world, I can make $500 an hour, life is going to be good. Right.
Yeah.
So those are out there. What I would caution people of is if a scholarship says it doesn't require an essay and it doesn't require grades or anything like that, I would be skeptical of those, because a lot of times it's almost just like a lottery at that point, and they're trying to gather they're trying to get your email address and that sort of thing. So does that mean all of them need a letter of recommendation? No, but just know that if they're at least requiring an essay and a transcript, it's probably worth your time and effort. There's a lot of really good local ones. I know at the school I'm at, we have an application just for 20 local scholarships that those 20 scholarships are going to go to members of the graduating class of my school. Right. And I know that they have those, and, whether it's the Hawthorne Woods, Killdeer, Lake Zurich, Commerce Society or whatever it is. Sometimes it's park districts, Friends of the Volo blog or bog or whatever it is have those, they are random. Usually you can get those from your school counseling office. Especially those more community ones. Those more community-based ones are probably a better use of time. But there are some, big ones, but those are more national. And as soon as you're in a national pool, it does feel a little bit more like elephant hunting.
Yeah. I think I heard of, there was someone was sharing, I think it was a client who was sharing that, their friend or one of their kids actually got a scholarship from, it was a company that was offering a scholarship, and basically it was to write an essay. But they got 4 years of at least tuition, maybe full ride covered. And then, so all of that is covered. And then they also have an internship at the end of it that's set up. So, so even just kind of who and thinking, okay, if this is what I'm going into, like who are the people I know that work in these industries or what they do or companies, those could probably be good ideas too.
Employers are great resources. I know like the Lake County Retired Teachers Association has one for people getting into education. There's, I think my dad's union had one when I was growing up. You'd see them a lot from union locals, like you said, from companies. The state of Illinois actually has some really good ones for students interested in special education. It's called the Illinois Special Education Teacher Tuition Waiver. And you have to attend a school in Illinois. and then obviously be studying special education, but that's tuition paid, fees and room and board. And then with that, there's also some, you have to teach in Illinois for 4 or 5 years after that. Another one is called the Golden Apple Scholars Foundation, which again is for educators. But just like you said, there's sometimes ones attached to, hey, we'll help pay for your education, but then you owe us 5 years after. At a lot of places, that's great. You have your job ready to go after that. So most of them aren't as lucrative as the one that you've mentioned, right? Most of them aren't full tuition or full room and board. But again, $500, $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, and you get 4 or 5 of those, that can add up.
Yeah. I even think, this is not college related, but even just like veterans, military, even for whether it's college, but even just like private education up through 12th grade those sometimes you can even actually get, fully covered by some of those organizations. So it's really just being aware of, what are your interests, hobbies, what are jobs that people, have, what your parents, grandparents, things that they were a part of, your heritage, like so many things, like you've kind of talked about. So
one more interesting example of that is University of Nebraska Lincoln offers in-state tuition to dependents of veterans and first responders. And then Michigan State University and Mississippi State University offer in-state tuition to children of dependents of veterans. So there's obviously kind of like you mentioned as well, there are the benefits that go along with the Illinois Veterans Grant and things like that as well. Sometimes if a person has been injured in the line of duty or whatever they're doing, there are opportunities for that as well. So.
Yeah. All right. So there's also different categories of scholarships. So let's touch on some of these. So sports is a big one. So, my kid's really good in sports. Do you see many kids that are getting sports scholarships to go to schools? And do you have to be like an amazing athlete and be the top athlete to be able to get them? Yeah,
I think that it's one of those things that people are kind of waiting. Again, the idea of elephant hunting, right? They're waiting for that big one. The statistic is, I think that 0.8% of all high school athletes will receive a fully funded scholarship, right? So less than 1%.
Wow.
1.2% of high school athletes will receive some sort of money to play a sport at the collegiate level. That can be a $500 book scholarship to go run track somewhere, right? Where if you're going to a school that's $60,000, that $500 in books doesn't do a ton. But I also think that there is a pretty significant obsession with this idea of Division I or bust. Division I is your Power Fives, your Big Tens, things like that, where a lot of people, there's also Division II, which a lot of people, I always say, okay, you think you're interested in Division II athletics, name me 10 Division II schools. And that's always a fun drill. Right. And that's part of the learning. The nice thing about Division II is you can receive athletic and academic money. At Division III schools, that's your Augustanas, Illinois Wesleyans, Elmhurst, North Park, places like that. Technically, you cannot receive any incentives based on your athletic ability. So any money you receive from those institutions has to be either merit or need. There are 2 other divisions that I think get forgotten about, and that's NAIA. So like Roosevelt University in the city, St. Xavier on the south side of Chicago, St. Ambrose in Davenport, Iowa. Those are all NAIA schools that you can then again be offered both merit-based and athletic scholarships. And there's 2 divisions of that. And then there's the National Junior College, which is College of Lake County, Harper, that sort of thing. They can offer some money as well. But in Division I, there's, as long as it's not football, men's and women's hoops or volleyball. So if you're playing what they call an Olympic sport, you can get merit and athletic as well. So if you're playing women's soccer, you can get a merit-based scholarship and athletic money from there as well.
Okay.
But again, it's, Division I is pretty hard to come by. So there's a lot of research done on that too. And it's the idea of like, and we're guilty of this, that the amount of money that you spend on club sports, had we just put that into our, 529, that we wouldn't have to worry about that. But again, there's, not everybody does it because they think they're going to get a Division I scholarship.
Yes.
But a generation ago, it was all about soccer. Now there's way too many people playing club soccer, and what it's gone to now is country club sports, field hockey, lacrosse, that's, fencing. So all of a sudden, again, in 10 years, we're going to see a bunch of fencers in the northwest suburbs. We're going to see people out in the front lawn swinging their swords at each other and that sort of thing. So, and that's kind of how it's changed. But again, those aren't sports that you can just take a basketball and show up at any local park and start doing your thing. There's an investment that has to be made to get there as well, to get that proper training. So,
no, that makes sense. Okay. So then let's shift, like academics is kind of another big area that people typically think, okay, you can get money for, just like you said, merit-based. Is that from GPA in high school? Is that from test scores, and which ones? All
of the above. There are some schools that are going test optional, or have gone, if you apply to a Marquette, a Xavier, a St. Louis University, you can qualify for very good scholarships with a test optional application. With that, though, especially again at some of your larger or your state flagship and state land grant institutions out of state, to qualify for those top scholarships, you're still going to need a top level test score, right? The transparency with test scores is higher in a lot of cases. Doesn't mean that there's still not a lot of really good opportunities test optional. With that said, the more selective, now it becomes less about merit and all about need. So a Northwestern, a University of Chicago, the Ivy League, they don't give scholarships based on on merit, because everybody would qualify for that, right? It's based on need and trying to, create some access opportunities by way of meeting needs. So,
on the GPA, is there like, this is the minimum you would need to qualify? Same with the scores of tests. Is there like, you need to be above this to even think you're going to get something?
Yeah. So it depends on the institution, right? Where, again, we've referenced your alma mater a couple of times, Kansas State University. They do a very nice job of it. It doesn't matter if it's weighted or unweighted. If you have a 3.8 or better, you qualify for in-state tuition.
Okay.
And that's very nice. University of Arkansas does the same thing, where some schools, they want unweighted, or they recalculate, or whatever it might be. Right. Okay. The more selective, the less it's about GPA, and it's more about the courses that you have taken and the grades that you get in those courses.
Okay.
So it's like, hey, you need to take the hardest classes your school offers and get the best grade available, because, again, a topic for a whole other podcast and probably a graduate level education course is the idea of grade inflation and that sort of thing. And so, colleges in some cases are trying to guard from that. And other cases, they're kind of embracing it and being like, hey, we think you can do fine on our campus, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Is there an ACT or SAT score that it needs to be above typically?
It depends on the school. Okay. I always kind of say, kind of as a rule of thumb, if you have once your ACT starts with a 3, you're kind of opening some doors, and I got to look at my trusty calculator, but I think it's a 1300 or better, is whatever the ACT equivalent is. Okay. That's what's the, ACT. It's nice because you only have to know 36 numbers, where SAT, you got to know 1600 and bands of 10. But and it just depends on the school. University of Alabama really kind of started this, especially in suburban Chicago, where if you go to their website, you'll see if you have this GPA and this test score, you know exactly what you qualify for. So if you go, you have a 35 or a 3.5 and a 32 to a 36, and whatever the SAT equivalent is, you qualify for $28,000 at University of Alabama for next school year, which now makes it like $16,000 a year to attend or something like that.
Okay, that's
and
helpful.
there's a lot of others where, like at University of Arkansas, if you have a 3.8 or better, they basically waive 90% of the out of state fee, and it makes it like 24 or 25 per year to go there. But in doing so, you don't really qualify for any more of their more competitive scholarships.
Okay, got it.
University of Missouri, University of Utah have pathways to residency. So after a year, you can get in-state tuition if you do these 3 things that you need to do to get residency. So
yeah. Okay. No, that makes sense. Some others that you mentioned just as we were talking, like geography or special talents, these are ways you can get scholarships. Do you want to kind of discuss those a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, everybody's looking for an oboe player from North Dakota, right? Especially the more selective, the more national the institution, they not only want to be representative internationally, but nationally. And for whatever reason, it's really hard to get students from like the Dakotas or Alaska or something like that. Again, orchestras have enough trombones, saxophones, and trumpets. And it's just, again, you never know what it is that someplace will need. But the thing that you also have to realize is, hey, you applied to this super selective school, or somebody a year above you did, and they played the oboe. And you do too, so you think you have an in. Guess what? They don't need you for the next 4 years because they got that oboe spot locked up for the next 4 years. So, it can also be, we hear about the athletes most of the time, but there's still opportunities for performers and, again, musicians and artists and that sort of thing. It's just, that's what's hard. That's even what I can't really inventory perfectly is what is every institution's need from year to year to year. So there's a luck calculus to some of that as well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think you said this really well before. You're kind of saying like kids want the money from these different scholarships, these different places, but they don't want to do the work to get the money. And that's a really big deal when you're talking about writing the essays, filling out. And those are the things you have to do to be able to be considered for these. Yeah,
they also have to do the research. Whenever I talk about that, I always talk about a story that my grandfather used to tell when he was asked in an interview one time, why do you want this job? And he said, it's not the job that I want, it's the money. Right. And that's the way it is for a lot of things. And when it comes to these scholarships, it's just understanding that to get the money, you got to do the work, and the work can be tedious.
Yes.
And it is what it is. Right. If that's what you need, otherwise, guess what? There are still 15 different options that can't wait to have you that your family can pay for, or you can pay for, or whoever it is, grandma and grandpa, whoever's helping, fund that education.
Yeah, I think it's so helpful. This is just a great reminder, too, to use these resources that you have in school. So counselors just like yourself who are guiding people and are there to help and point you to and show you these things and explain them. So use these resources that you have. Be talking to people. So I guess, we hear all of your experience, all of your expertise, everything that you know about all of these schools. So Nate, if your kid was going to be going to school in the next 1 year, 3 years, what would be the things that you would be making a priority for helping them to be set up well?
Going back to the point you just made to Michelle real quick before we move on, is everything you just talked about is self-advocacy, right? Like I can't get to every student in the high school. So at some point a student has to have the willingness to say, I need help, which is a life skill in a lot of ways. But as far as what it looks like for my boys, we already kind of plant this seed a little bit. The idea of like, if we're being honest, my wife and I are both educators. If they were going into it right now without any sort of special talents or anything like that, except with the exception of maybe one Big Ten school, a Big Ten education, unfortunately, would be probably not in a realistic option for them. Right. And it's just the idea of understanding how much it costs and why. So it's the idea of, we would be taking trips to Stillwater, Oklahoma, and I can't think and where in Starkville, Mississippi, where Mississippi State is at, and that, and maybe going to some of the smaller private liberal arts schools and that sort of thing. So it's just, I guess both of my boys are fortunate in the sense that both parents do have college degrees. Obviously, Dad does this for a living. So we've been having these discussions and have been on college campuses, since we've gotten out on road trips. Right. So while we'll never just sit down and say, okay, each of you has X a year to go to school, they will have an understanding that a school that costs $60,000, $65,000, $70,000 per year, and unless something extraordinary happens, isn't probably in the cards. But that doesn't mean that there's not a ton of other really good options. And I think part of it is just giving them the space to explore and grow, but at the same time creating expectations. And this is when it becomes our job to be parents and make parent types of decisions, right up there with taking away the cell phone or the social media or the iPad or whatever it is. It's that. And that's what I've, seen a lot is, and as parents, we never want to disappoint our children. And I get that. But at the same time, we also have to create expectations and realistic expectations and deal in reality. And I think that's where we're at with the Bargar brothers. And unless, something really happens with the fastball or the football or the basketball, or because they definitely don't have any artistic skills. I'll tell you that. So
that's where it's like, get the good grades, try your best. It's all of those things. Yeah, no, correct. I think that makes so much sense. And it's just so helpful to hear just this wide variety of all the things to consider. But there are so many resources and options and things that are out there, but you just might have to search for them, work for them. But it is possible because we see people getting them. So, Any kind of closing thoughts, anything you want to add that we maybe haven't touched on that you just want to be sure people are aware of or just encouraged by?
I think the biggest thing is just ask questions and be open to the actual answer. The other thing that we see in my field especially is there's a lot of experts, and they're experts by way of, I have 3 kids and they've applied to these 9 schools. So now I'm an expert in this, where I always make the argument of like, look, I do this with, 300 students every year and work with 150 schools. And that's not to say that I'm, I'm not building rockets by any means, but at the same time, what people will take as absolute truths in this whole process. And then when they ask someone, me or one of my colleagues, this question, and our answer is different, they look at us like we're crazy, or we're trying to ruin their students' future, where just be willing to ask good questions, utilize the resources that are out there. From one parent to another, I would say, please be good listeners. Please allow space for our students to fail in safe environments. And then when, take that opportunity to lift them up, dust them off, and say, let's go try it again, because, hey, you didn't get the answer you wanted to this question. That's the way it's going to work sometime. Let's try the next one, sort of thing. Right. And really just encouraging that idea of self-advocacy and being a good support system. And at the same time, not being afraid to have hard conversations. And as we know, as parents, some of those hardest conversations to have with our families, whether it's our siblings, our parents, but most importantly, our own children, is about money, because as you well know, and why a CFP is in the human development side of it, it is a sensitive conversation for so many people. So the more that we can prepare them for that, and again, and using great resources like at school, folks like what you guys do to kind of help plan for that, I think we'll all be better off, and hopefully lower the angst involved a little bit.
Exactly. Yep. I would just say, yes, the biggest thing is that just because you can't afford the most expensive college does not mean that you can't come out with just as good of experience and knowledge as someone who did pay a lot more. So
absolutely.
No, that's great. I think this has been so helpful. Thank you so much for joining us, Nate.
Thanks again, Michelle, and enjoy your weekend.
In today's world, things change so fast, and no doubt there will be quite a few updates to these processes as time goes on. But I just want to encourage you to sign up for our bi-weekly email on our website so that you can stay updated with all of our latest content, just like conversations like this. But for today, that is all, and we will see you on the next episode. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. To find any links or resources related to this episode, check out our show notes. Your host was Michelle Smallenberger, a certified financial planner and CEO. The guests featured are from Financial Design Studio, a team of experienced, fiduciary, fee-only advisors based in Chicago. Anna Lewis is the executive producer of the Behind the Designs podcast. And as always, for more information about Financial Design Studio and who we are, check out our website, financialdesignstudio.com. And final note, no content discussed on this podcast should be taken as financial advice. Financial Design Studio accepts no responsibility for your individual choices. We'll see you in the next episode.